As the global power balance shifts, a new league emerges, not of nations seeking harmony, but powers bent on reshaping the world under their rule. Russia, Iran, China, and North Korea increasingly assert their dominance, challenging the very fabric of the free world. Utilizing a range of strategies from military assertiveness to economic pressure and influencing democratic processes, these nations pursue their interests with an agenda that prioritizes extending their influence over peaceful coexistence. Today's panel will dissect these complex relationships and the coordinated efforts of these regimes. We'll explore how their push for control poses a stark challenge to global stability and what it means for the future of freedom.
Hi, good morning. It's great to be here. This is actually my third year at this great conference. And one of the things that reminds me of how much the world is changing and how much we need to be prepared for change is the idea of this panel wouldn't even have occurred to us in the first year. So one of the first things I wanted to pose to our panelists is there is a lot of growing concern about the relationship between these powers in trade, weapons help, but how much of this is durable in terms of an alliance, a bloc, a partnership, or whatever you want to call it? Maybe start with Steve and then go
Sure.
ahead.
Thank you, Sharon, and thank you to PISM for inviting me to join you. This is my first year. It's been an excellent conference, so pleasure to be here with all of you. We are debating in the United States very much this question of durability. And where I come down, Sharon, is that it's not a durable partnership between these four countries, but it is real, it is present, and it is dangerous. And so durable in the long run, we can take some solace in that. But in the long run, it doesn't so much matter to us right now as in the short run. And in the short run, these countries are providing significant assistance to each other. We've seen them running political cover for each other in international bodies to prevent isolation and condemnation. We've seen them providing economic support to each other in order to compensate for areas in which their economies may have been hurt by sanctions or export controls. We've seen exchanges between them, including in up to military equipment, with it being in the unbelievable circumstance now where the Iranians and North Koreans are providing the weapons to kill Europeans in Ukraine, which is just a stunning thing when I think about particularly North Korea. North Korea has injected itself into a war in Europe. So it's real and it's dangerous, but I don't think it's durable. It's not durable because there are no shared history here for this relationship to stand on. It's not durable because there's no shared values unless you take a very twisted view of values as keeping your hold on power, corruption, repressing your own people and opposing freedom underpinned by liberal democracies, with hardly a sense of values that would unite countries together. There's no shared history. Many of these countries have actually been adversaries and even at war, and there is very little positive shared history they can fall back on. When we gather at a setting like this, we can recall the moments in recent and past history where we've joined in common cause in noble undertakings. Can you imagine 20 years from now, Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping sitting around slapping their knees and saying, remember when we took down Ukraine in 2022? I mean, it's absurd. And it's, above all, transactional. It's based upon the personal relationships of four leaders, two in particular, who see at this moment great purpose in having cooperation with each other. But it won't be durable because it doesn't extend beyond those two leaders. It's an interesting thing about dictatorships. Dictators don't have deputy dictators. And the reason they don't have deputies is because a number two in a dictatorship has only one objective, to become number one. And so we can speculate that someone will succeed each of these leaders when they someday pass from the scene by either the choice of their own people or by biological realities. But that the idea that this transactional relationship could endure that transition seems to me to be a stretch.
Well, just to pick up on that and biological realities, does the death of Iran's president and foreign minister affect that at all?
Iran's president doesn't run Iran. Iran is run by the supreme leader. It's a fanatical, extremist religious state run by the Ayatollah. Presidents will come and go, but the real point of crisis for Iran will be when it comes time to select a new Ayatollah, because just like other dictatorships, there is no chosen successor.
On this durability of this alliance, it really depends, in my view, on the success of Russia in Ukraine, and the reason is quite simple. If you look why those countries cooperate, it is a collective desire to create a new world order, an anti-Western world order. Now, if you read, for example, the joint statement by Putin and Xi last week, then it is absolutely clear that there is a lot of rhetoric about a just and fair world order, world democracy, respect for sovereignty, by the way, which is also included in the joint statement. But this doesn't count, of course, for Ukraine. Now, what happens here, if you read this joint statement, then it's absolutely clear that winning this war is far more important than peace for China and for Russia. Because if Russia doesn't win this war, it's a victory for the collective West, as they call it. And that is hugely important, because if this is a victory for the collective West, then it's impossible to create this new desired world order. And that is exactly what is on paper. If you read between the lines, then this is the message. So there will be no desire to have negotiations for peace or a political solution, a ceasefire, whatever, because this is more important. And at the same time, this is a marriage of convenience between the four countries mentioned. And it is not durable in a way that if Russia loses, then the coalition will collapse. If Russia wins, it will be reinforced. So we simply cannot say how durable it is right now. But that brings me to a strategy towards Russia. Overstretch is a real danger for Russia. If you look what happens right now, enlargement of NATO, we put more money in our defenses. The cooperation and the relationship with the southern former Soviet republics is weakened. There are huge problems for Russia in the high north. So there is a real danger that Russia has to spend too much money on its own defense. And Putin referred in one of his recent speeches to this when he said, look, the West brought us down at the end of the Cold War because we had to spend too much money on our defense, and this won't happen anymore. But it happens already. So there is a real reason that because of overstretch, Russia will collapse. And this is something we should keep in mind. It's not the sanctions, but it is the expenditure on defense that could bring Russia down in the end. And this is something we should encourage. That's part of the strategy.
Yes. Well, thank you. My view is that it's a group of countries that is a group. They're not allies. They have overlapping interests. They support each other up to a point, but not the same point. They play on the weaknesses of the West, and they are embarked upon what I'll call a hybrid war against the West because they want to undermine the rules-based order. They want a new world order. It is a major project, and when I say major, I'll measure it in decades. Actually, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov this weekend at a conference talked about relations with Russia and the West. It will go on, current state will go on for a generation. That's more than a decade, in my view. In my view, their profiles also differ. I mean, risk taker number one, that's Iran, in my view. Risk taker number two, that's Russia. And we will definitely witness innovation when it comes to hybrid war. And a lot of things will be weaponized. There will be cooperation among them, but in my view, primarily bilaterally. So of course, and then, as always, events will occur, and they will use those opportunities. That will be my introduction. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I hope it is endurable, but the North Koreans have had this alignment with the People's Republic of China, the Soviet Union, and now Russia for the past nearly 80 years. And we never thought that the North Koreans could survive this long. And the North Koreans have been able to do a lot of things that we thought that they could not do. As of now, the Korean Peninsula is in a state of war. All my life, I've been in a country where we have been in a state of war. And when you live in a country like that, you forget that you're in a state of war, which is to the detriment of why we human beings go to war again and again and again. To remind the audience of where North Korea is, they now have the ability to strike South Korea, Japan, and probably Guam with an accurate nuclear device, ballistic missiles, hypersonic, cruise, and even a nuclear-tipped torpedo. It's only a matter of time that they will be able to hit not only the United States, but any European country that comes to the aid of Northeast Asia. So this is not just my problem. And another reason that it is not my problem, as stated before, is that the North Koreans are willing to proliferate. So we know that already the North Koreans have provided at least 50 to 100 Iskandars to the Russians to be shot at the Ukraine. And even in the Israeli conflict, the 300 or so cruise missiles and ballistic missiles launched by Iran, most of that technology came from North Korea. So they are more than willing to proliferate their capabilities. Finally, what really concerns me is that Mr. Putin waited for Kim Jong-un, which he normally does not do. He opened the door for Kim Jong-un, which normally he doesn't do, and he gave Kim Jong-un $1 million car. So how long this will last, not sure, but for the time being, is 1 year too long or 5 years too long? It's going to be a great relationship that will endanger the peace of the entire world.
So picking up on that point and making this a question for the entire panel, even if it's not a durable partnership or alliance, are there elements of Western sanctions being sort of the cornerstone of our policy, at least in response to the Ukraine war? Has it failed? Because as it was supposed to isolate countries, but in many ways it's created its own trading bloc of oil, of weapons, of dual-use goods.
I completely agree. I think that we overestimated the effects of sanctions. When I said it in the media in the Netherlands, everybody thought I was mad. But if you are familiar with the literature on sanctions, then you know that it is impossible to coerce a country to stop a military adventure. That is simply impossible. But what we see now is extremely damaging for Russia, because what we see now is a complete decoupling of the economy of East and West. There was already no economic relationship with the US whatsoever. But what we now see is a complete decoupling. The Russians are now investing in railway connections between Russia through Iran to the harbors in the Persian Gulf, and that tells you something, because the East-West trade is about to stop. The problem, however, is that we need certain critical raw materials from Russia, for example, palladium. And here we see a circumvention of the sanctions, because palladium, which is crucial for the semiconductor industry, is still coming to Europe and to the US. But it doesn't go through Europe, but it goes through Turkey and the United Arab Emirates. So there is something going on right now, and we do nothing about it because it will affect the semiconductor industry. So yes, we are decoupling. That will be hugely damaging in combination with the military build-up required by Putin because he has to defend a country of 11 time zones. And that could create havoc for the Russians in the long term, but not in the short term. In the short term, they're pretty well. They're doing pretty well.
Sharon, sanctions are an important tool in the toolbox for sure, but sanctions are not an outcome. They're a means to achieve an outcome, and sanctions aren't even in of themselves a good policy. They have to be part of more effective policy. They haven't been used in isolation. Of course, the United States and its Western partners, and here I extend the notion of the West to our partners in Asia, who have also rallied to the support of Ukraine. Much support has been given to Ukraine, but as we've discussed over already the morning that we've been here, at times too slow, lacking in urgency, and not delivering the right systems at the right time for the Ukrainians, not only to save the lives of the flower of their youth, but to win the war. And I think underpinning this is this lack of urgency. And I think that may be one of the most debilitating things in this conflict. The sanctions would have been effective with a far more intense, upfront military reaction to Vladimir Putin's invasion. In fact, sanctions could have been part of an effective deterrent that perhaps could have ever had him enter Ukraine. Instead, we've chosen to take a pathway built on what I consider to be a false assumption that a longer, lower intensity conflict presents less risk of escalation than a sharp and decisive conflict. And so what do we have as a consequence of that? We see regimes beginning to re-engineer their economies to evade the sanctions. That's what comes from a slower, lower intensity conflict. We also see new parties entering, the theme of this panel today. Iran did not enter this war until year 2. North Korea did not enter this war until year 3. Had this war ended in year 1, we wouldn't be here today talking about this axis of upheaval or axis of rogues or all the other cliches and labels that have been thrown around. It wouldn't have happened. A shorter, sharper conflict would have been much more decisive, and the sanctions would have been a much more effective part of that policy.
The West does have many problems, not only one, that's for sure. But the fact is that the bigger picture is not only about Ukraine. This is about a new world order. And the point is that we, the West, we are not really formulated a policy on how to protect and how to counter the threats against the rules-based order. We are nowhere near a strategy. That's the first point I'll make. Second point, we tend to compartmentalize our analysis and policy making when it comes to the 4 countries in question. I mean, we talk about Russia and the West, we talk about Iran and the West, China and the West, and North Korea and the West. The bigger picture, I say it's easier said than done. I know that, but it does have consequences but on how we also formulate policy and gather collect political public support for the policy to be pursued. Of course, we have made mistakes the way we read or dealt with Russia. Still, China, we have, I mean, the understanding that political, in those countries, politics does have priority, not the economics. And the West is still not there on China, that is for sure. It's difficult to influence the countries. Russia, definitely, we have touched upon that. Also in the previous plan is step up support. Ukraine is a key. I mean, in our debate, public debate, I quite often miss the point that the best way really to change the regime in Russia, that is to get a prosperous and democratic Ukraine. That will have a long-term positive impact on Russia. There are problems, I know that. I'll stop here.
Very little to add, except that I want to remind everyone that it's not just North Korea that's playing an action here. It's also my country, the Republic of Korea. We're proud to say that Poland has made some wide decisions in procuring the best systems that my country produces, as well as our willingness to transfer technology. I personally worry about that, but right now we're willing to share our technology with other nations, and our weapon systems, not all of them, but the ones chosen by Poland are really great weapon systems. And so sanctions might never have worked, but there is, I guess, some silver lining into this story.
We've touched on a bit of this in this conversation, but given some of the, whether sanctions work or not, what should we be doing now in light of this partnership and bloc?
I think that one of the key issues is that we simply are too late. We now have a discussion on changing world order. This is visible already for 10 years. And all of a sudden we have a discussion now. It reminds me of what Julian just said. So I'm sick and tired of having the same discussion all over again and nothing happens. That is also my idea. This is already visible for 10 years. And we now start to understand that there is a broader context for this crisis in Ukraine. So something will change. But the problem is that it could be too late. And one of the key issues is that we in the West, especially in Europe, cannot do power politics anymore. We do not know what coercion is, how to do that. We use the internal market and access to the internal market to change the behavior of countries. But if you have countries who do not want to have this access or block the access, then you simply cannot have leverage over those countries anymore. And you should do coercion, you should do power politics. And that is something we simply cannot do anymore. The problem is, and Julian mentioned it as well, we need France, UK and Germany. But those countries are postmodern. They forgot how to do it. They are preoccupied with internal problems. We do not see security in territorial terms anymore, in terms of sovereignty. We see security in human terms. We call that progress. And I think it is progress, because we are preoccupied with injustice in the world. And that is also how we look at Ukraine. We have to end injustice. But this is more than injustice. This is about power in Europe. This is about the European security architecture in the future. And this is about world order. And we simply have no idea how to deal with it. So it's a mentality shift first. It's about resilience of the population. And then we can move forward. We should have discussions like this with the broader public. Politicians should understand what's going on here. And I'm afraid that too few politicians understand what's going on.
Anyone else care to talk about what we should be doing?
We can recognize the challenge of these four countries colluding together as a single problem and still consider the right response to be different answers. And I do think the answers are different for different countries in this group. With Iran and North Korea, our policy has to be an unflinching resolve at containment. We have to limit resources. We have to shrink time horizons. We have to proscribe the choices that they can make in order to press them into a less hostile and less dangerous state. In the case of China, we need a strong deterrent. If we look at the Russian invasion, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, there's only one person to blame. We know where blame lies. But in terms of the mistakes that led up to it, we can find many authors. We can find it in the tolerance for the deep corruption in the 1990s in Russia and the failure for accountability for the Soviet system during that era that allowed the manifestation of a new set of security-minded authoritarians. We can look at the brutal war in Chechnya and the false flag operations in Moscow that killed innocent Russians in order to justify restarting a conflict in Chechnya. We can look at the Russian invasion of Georgia in 2008, or for that matter, Vladimir Putin's Munich Security Conference speech in 2008, when he told us to our face what he was going to do. We can look at 2014, the annexation of Crimea and the invasion of eastern Ukraine and the weak response of the West. When you roll all that up to 2022 and you look back, you can see that there are two things that failed. We failed at deterrence, and there was a failure of imagination. We have to deter China. If we knew then what we know now, when Russia crossed the border into Ukraine in February of 2022, what more would we have done to stop that? Knowing if we did, the level of misery and death and economic destruction and the intractability of the conflict and the degree to which it created tremors that destabilized other parts of the world. What would we have done? That's how we have to think about the challenge of China. Deterrence. We have to make sure that we do not get to this point. That can also include engagement. Deterrence with engagement is actually effective deterrence. But with Russia, containment won't work. Deterrence has already failed. There's only one option with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and that's to defeat Russia. In order to defeat Russia, in order to ensure that Ukraine is victorious, we do have to have a clear idea of what that is. And in a sense, Ukraine already has been victorious, because Vladimir Putin set out to eliminate the nation of Ukraine and absorb it into Russia, and he has abjectly failed at that. But even if the Ukrainians at some point reclaim some or more or all of their territory, this war will not be over, because Vladimir Putin, even in that instance, will be able to represent it in Moscow as a victory for himself. There's no question in my mind. There's only one thing that will be a clear refutation of Putin that will make it impossible for him to sell to his own people that he was victorious, and will ensure that President Zelensky can deliver the sense of victory to his people, and that's to allow Ukraine into the NATO alliance. There is no way that Vladimir Putin will sell in Moscow that a Ukrainian membership in NATO was victory in this war, and that's what we need to do.
I agree, but my question is how? In Europe, we neglected our armed forces for 30 years. In the past, I took part in the complete reorganization of the Dutch armed forces, and we created something that is completely unfit for the present situation, and not only in the Netherlands, but also in Germany and in most other European countries. So we don't have to do it. If you want to do something, you have to send in troops. Are you willing to do that? US? That's question number one. And the next issue is, of course, yes, I'm in favor of NATO membership, but how to do it and how then to give guarantees, security guarantees for Ukraine. I'm in favor of doing that, but how can we do it? So the how question is crucial.
Yeah, it's a good question, and let me answer it. First thing I'd do is I would deploy NATO air defense capabilities to the northeastern border of Poland and the northeastern border of Romania with a sufficient distance to be able to extend over the airspace of both Lviv and Odessa. Russians have already fired missiles through the airspace of NATO countries. If we are determined to enforce our commitment at not 1 inch, that has to both be land and air and sea. We should put those NATO air defense is there to cover 360 degrees to relieve the Ukrainians of any responsibility to cover the western portions of their country so that they can push their defenses further to the north. In the Black Sea, which the Ukrainians have had tremendous success in driving the Russian fleet back, we should still be able to ensure the freedom of navigation of all shipping, including Ukrainian shipping in international waters, with maritime and aerial escorts. We showed in the interception of the Iranian ballistic missiles and other munitions fired at Israel that our air forces are capable of providing that level of defense, and we need to do the same for the Ukrainians now. We should have Ukrainian forces training at a minimum in Poland, being trained by NATO partners, and the assistance effort to Ukraine should be through NATO mechanisms, not through the Ramstein group, so that we are simultaneously reinforcing training and techniques that are consistent with NATO operations, as well as the interoperability that the Ukrainians need in their equipment to ultimately successfully become a NATO member. And then we need to do everything we can, faster, further than we have, to provide the Ukrainians the ability to win this war with the army that they have in the field. And if they can't do that, then we have to think about other things.
And who is we?
Would we do what I just described?
Is it the US, or does it include all?
The President of the United
countries?
States has it within his ability to do all of these things under executive authority. There's already plenty of reservation about Ukraine's invitation to begin accession talks. There's reservations, and have been persistent reservations, about deploying certain systems into Ukraine for fear of escalation. Ironically, all of them ultimately ended up in Ukraine, which is the ultimate indictment of that overcaution and self-deterrence that has been exercised so frequently in this war. I don't want to be ungenerous. I don't want to minimize the degree to which the United States and the West have shown leadership in helping Ukraine. I'm talking about the speed, the urgency, the quality, but not the sincerity. And we couldn't have imagined in February 2022 that we would be sitting here talking about ATACMS and Patriots, and we could barely decide to deliver javelins to the Ukrainians prior to this conflict. But again, failure of deterrence, failure of imagination. We already failed at deterrence. That ship has sailed. Let's not fail at imagination.
This is very interesting for me as a Korean, because I live in a neighborhood that has very powerful neighbors and now a nuclear-armed enemy. Everything that is done in Ukraine and that is not done in Ukraine is something that all of us Koreans see happening to us in the future, or foreseeably not in the future. What can we do about all of this? It's very obvious. We prepare for war, right? But the reality is 90% of my people don't want to go to war. 70% of my people are really afraid of war. And I guess it's natural. We Koreans, we South Koreans, we spend about 2.3% of our GDP on defense, about 18% of our budget on defense, and yet we're still incapable of matching the North Koreans, who have 1/60th of our economy, because they're able to invest all of their capital into strategic weaponry, not to mention a huge conventional army that they have. The edge that they have is nuclear weapons. So my question to the European audience is, South Koreans, why can't we have our own nuclear deterrent? The NPT now needs to really reevaluate the situation that we have throughout the world, where countries like North Korea are nuclearly armed, and where does it leave South Korea? Because we are now tied from countering this kind of threat. And ladies and gentlemen, I believe that thugs like Putin and Xi and Kim Jong-un, they only believe in strength and the will. And they know that Americans have a problem killing women and children. They must never have that kind of doubt if we are to be considered seriously.
I fully agree with what has been said about the necessity for NATO or the West to step up military support. Nothing to add to that. But I believe the fact is that Russia's situation on the battlefield would have been much worse if it hadn't been for Chinese support. I came across a quote by Jens Stoltenberg in a speech in Berlin where he says that Berlin continues to fuel the largest armed conflict in Europe since World War II. So, and they cannot have both good relations with the West at the same time. That's a basic message. So step up support, what is to be done, and then the West, we need to work more on the BRICS. It's much more, it's not that homogeneous, that group, certainly not, and we definitely have to nuance our policy on the global South. The problem is long-term when we have to mid-term, long-term, when we have to protect the world order as we cherish. Where's the forum? I mean, we have G7 for obvious reasons, although when it comes to those countries, South Korea and Australia certainly are stakeholders in the problem. NATO, I really don't see it, even though there's outreach because NATO too transatlantic and some allies do have principles which make it difficult. EU, I don't see it. So we will end up with a lot of bilateralism or small groups. What does that mean? I believe it's difficult to see, in the near future at least, a proactive Western policy emerge, because we are not there yet where that is possible. What will drive it? Events, my boy, to use a quote. And the risk is, of course, we will continue to be behind the curve. So that's where we are. That's our challenge. So for such a long-term project. Thank you.
Just to pick up on the point about China, the conventional wisdom is that it has been Chinese assistance to Russia that's been instrumental in Russia's gains on the battlefield, and certainly there must be some element of truth to that. But I think the inverse is actually also true, which is Russia's successes on the battlefield have been instrumental in gaining delivery of more Chinese assistance. A year, 2 years ago, to speak to Chinese officials about Russia's invasion of Ukraine was to get a sheepish reaction, rationalized in a tortured way to square China's support for Russia with Chinese principles of foreign policy. The Chinese, in a sense, had a bit of buyer's regret about backing a loser. But as Vladimir Putin, in part because of our hesitation, in part because of my own country's hesitation to provide the necessary assistance to the Ukrainians when they needed it, Vladimir Putin has picked up momentum on the battlefield. It's inescapable. We all see it in the news. And that has begun to sink in with some conviction in Beijing that actually maybe Beijing bet on a winner. And that's a very dangerous thing for us. The more Putin succeeds, the more he's likely to gain support from Beijing, which is just another reason why the defeat of Russia in Ukraine is so important to us.
So I want to pick up on that point with some recent events. Yesterday, I believe it was yesterday, UK's defense minister said that he could reveal that we have evidence that China and Russia are collaborating on combat equipment for use in Ukraine. It was a little bit confusing, and I think later in the day, Jake Sullivan said that that line hadn't been passed. But the Chinese provision of lethal aid to Russia for use in Ukraine has long been a concern for the West. So whether that line has been passed or not, what do you think it would take for China to actually do it, and what should be the West's response?
Well, there's so many ways that it's already happening. We're talking about degrees here. And I saw the report as well, Sharon, and I don't have any access to any information that could confirm or refute that. But it does underscore something else for us, that these conflicts are linked. we actually have a school of strategic thought, if you can call it that, in the United States evolving, that the Ukraine war is not important to the United States of America. Ukraine's war for independence is not important to us. Our focus has to be in Asia. Now, there are some very smart people who I respect greatly, like Elbridge Colby, who have written on this. In what I admire about Bridge is that he doesn't discount the importance of defeating Putin in Ukraine. He just believes there should be a division of resources. And there's a logic to that. It's not one that I share because I think both of these are a fight. And I think the United States of America has a vital national security interest in the security and freedom of Europe. But the most worrisome thing to me about those arguments, even when they're made well, is that they provide cover for isolationists to masquerade as strategists. We have many voices in the United States who are calling for us to leave Ukraine because China is a more important threat. But I can tell you that if the democratic peoples in Asia are depending on those people for their security, they're in big trouble. The United States has interests in peace and security in Asia, peace and security in Europe, and we need to remain committed to that. And if there is no greater evidence for us on why those are linked, we simply have to watch what Russia and China are doing together because they understand it.
I think it's quite difficult to do something about it. We know that most Chinese companies more or less obey to the sanctions. That's in their own interest. At the same time, we know that a lot of semiconductors go from China to Russia, so there is already support. There's also economic support because it's now a lot of Russian gas doesn't go to Europe anymore, but to China. But what can we do? The problem is also that there are huge interdependencies between the West and China. For example, we need critical raw materials coming from China. We need certain technologies that allow us to have a green economy. So it's extremely difficult, for example, to decouple the Chinese economy from the Western economy. And that's probably the only way of really coercing China. So I cannot see that many options right now to do this and to really block the export of, for example, weapons from China to Russia. Moreover, what we also know, and look what Russia did already in 2014 when it carried out the annexation of the Crimea. Some leaders are willing to sacrifice their own economy for a bigger good, and that's changing of the world order.
Well, my view is that I'm not surprised, but I don't know anything about it. But when I say I'm not surprised, we should be prepared for being constantly tested. Small steps, how do we react, and so on. So, and we can be tested in several ways. Also, as I said, with regard to the innovation of the instruments, with regard to the hybrid war, and so on. So we are just walking down a new path, and this will be difficult. And we have to, at some point, no is a no, and we have to show it. Thank you.
So just to pick up on that, if China were to publicly say, yes, we're providing lethal aid to Russia for Ukraine, what should be the response? Would there be a response?
Well, can there be a response? I think that is the question.
My response would be that's a failure on our part as well. That would be my response, because I don't think we actually need coercion with China, and I don't think we need. We certainly don't want conflict with China. What we need is a deterrence. Deterrence is to be clear that the consequences of those steps will be so costly that they're not worth taking. That's where we have to be clear. That's where partnership between the United States and Europe on potential measures. Those are the things that I think we do. I don't think we need to embark upon decoupling. I don't think we need to use coercion. I think we actually need engagement. But all of that only works with deterrence. And deterrence means having a formidable toolbox of responses from security to economics that we can draw upon. And we can only put that together working as a collective West.
Yes, I completely agree. But the question is, again, how? Because I just mentioned, and Julian also mentioned, a couple of major European countries who became postmodern, who can't do power politics anymore, coercion, they have no idea how to do it anymore. And I completely agree with you that we have to work together because this is a part of the solution. But to be honest, I do not always trust Western politicians.
Well, actually, we've focused on China. What about North Korea? Are there any ways to deter it from providing weapons for Russia for use in Ukraine? Do we have any tools left?
I don't think so. Right now, North Korea, Kim Jong-un is not crazy. He's not an Idi Amin. He's a very shrewd, calculating leader. And the way that he's been showcasing his teenage daughter, it implies that he's not going to be the last Kim. It implies that whoever his successor is, it'll be another Kim. It's amazing how that society has been able to continue. So North Korea is a real big problem. And even in dealing with the Chinese, North Korea has a potential to be a chip because surprise, surprise, even the North Koreans do not like the Chinese. When they first exploded their nuclear device, it is said that Kim Jong-il, Kim Jong-un's father, exclaimed, "Now we don't have to worry about the Chinese." He didn't say we don't have to worry about the Americans. So there's a possibility there that North Korea could actually be something that could balance or off-balance China. Can you imagine if the North Koreans were against the Chinese, what that would be like in that region? So there's a possibility there. But in direct answer to your question, I'm not a pessimist, but in dealing with North Korea, especially Kim Jong-un, there are so many vulnerabilities in that society that they're even afraid of our music, and yet they're able to sustain themselves through starvation, sanctions, and all of this, and have been able to successfully develop all these weapons. And it's not just nuclear weapons. Electronic warfare. They have a very advanced electronic warfare capability. We also term the North Koreans as cyber superpowers. So these kind of capabilities exist. And to be very honest with you, the challenge of deterring North Korea is a very big challenge. And again, it's not just my problem. It's a world problem, maybe bigger than China or even the Russians.
I agree completely with Mr. M. And this is why I think containment is the right strategy for North Korea. But at risk of sounding like a broken record, if we want to curtail the delivery of arms from North Korea to Russia, make sure that Ukraine is victorious in its war of independence, defeat Russia. That's the simplest and most straightforward and, quite honestly, the one that's the best choice for us on addressing this problem.
Great. I think I will actually turn to the audience for questions. I think that there are microphones available. I saw a hand. Did I see a hand over there? Yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Jason Worledge. I'm the Resident Program Director for the National Republican Institute. Great to see you again, Steve. This question is actually more for you. What degree of confidence would you say that you have in our European partners to play a role in deterrence towards China, considering as we speak right now, the PLA is more or less entirely circling Taiwan and a set of military activities designed to punish separatism as a result of the inauguration this week? Thank you.
We're getting there, is what I would say. We do have increasing strategic dialogue and cooperation, and we've done some incredibly innovative things in the alliance in just the recent few years, including bringing in Asian partners, Asia-Pacific partners, including Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand to our considerations. All four will be represented at the leader level at the NATO summit in Washington, D.C. Just 7 weeks from now. So we are integrating transatlantic security and Indo-Pacific security, and I think this is the right thing to do. We've got great leadership from the European Commission. I think the dialogue between the United States and the European Commission has produced quite a bit of alignment. Member states and within their various areas of responsibility have different interests that they continue to defend. We heard a little bit about that up here today. The value of deterrence is that Germany can still conduct its auto trade, and France can conduct its trade with deterrence. Deterrence is the safety net that allows us to explore the limits of a normal relationship with China while avoiding the worst case possible outcomes. I think that has to sink into Europe, but then it has to be complemented, of course, by an issue that the previous panel talked about at some length and that we should talk about again, which is the necessity to have the capabilities to do so. Political will, U.S.-European transatlantic alignment, and capabilities are going to be absolutely the critical elements to having a good policy that keeps peace and security, not just in Europe, but in the Indo-Pacific as well.
I think a question up in the middle row. Yes. Thank you.
Super, thank you. Agnieszka Leguska from PISM. Can we play with the myth busting? Because one thing what is also outcome of your panel is that actually those regimes, the aim or the winning strategy is to stay in power, to stabilize the system and state power as a dictator or tyranny. And also the outcome of that kind of internal system is exactly aggression towards neighbors or like threatening others with changing the global order. It's like a tool to preserving power. But and also that was the thing that was raised in the first panel, that we are afraid of successor of Putin, about the destabilization of Russia. However, when I look at it from the distance, it looks that we're not supposed to be afraid of destabilization Russia. We should keep pressure by sanctions, by other actions, because actually destabilization of those regimes are much bigger threat to us than so-called destabilization. Thank you.
So this is about fear of destabilization of Russia. Personally, I'm not afraid for that because what I argued is that we should strive for overstretch. We should help Putin to spend too much money on, for example, its defense, and then the whole thing will collapse in the end. The problem is we simply do not know when this will happen. It could take another 10 years, and God knows what will happen then in Ukraine. So I think that the collapse of Russia should never be an issue that guides your policy making. The short-term issue is, let's say, for the next 1, 2, 3 years, is what will happen in Ukraine. If Ukraine loses, we have a huge problem with respect to European security, and this will also reinforce the changing of the world order at a global scale. But on the other hand, in my view, this regime is not durable, but for different reasons. So this is not about the collapse of the regime. If Russia is defeated in Russia, it probably will stay. The real problem is overstretch for Russia.
I think we had a question up here in the second row. Great.
Konstantin Agate. My question is to whoever cares to answer, probably Steve actually. One country that was not hugely mentioned during this discussion is actually Iran. And we do know that Iran helps in a very material and practical way, without any equivocation, helps Putin to prosecute the war. What can be done about that? Could Israel be brought on board more to exert more pressure on Tehran, including maybe through some kind of paramilitary operations? And Steve, what do you expect will happen in case we have a new administration in Washington with regard to Iran and its links to Russia? Thank you.
So in regard to Iran, we need a much more effective containment strategy. While Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine is a catastrophe of scale, the longer-term and much more pernicious challenge that we've faced from any of these four countries is the deeply destabilizing activities of the Iranians among many of its neighbors, including Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, and also their support for Hamas. And make no mistake about it, Hamas is a creation of the regime in Tehran. They were funded, they're trained, and they're equipped by the Iranians in anticipation of them undertaking exactly the kind of terrible and destabilizing atrocities that were done on October 7th. We make a mistake oftentimes of misaligning ourselves in our relationship with other countries. Iran has sought to destroy Israel since the Islamic Revolution. And the Israelis have never mistaken that and have acted accordingly. We ourselves are, in effect, engaged in a war with Russia. I am fairly convinced that the president of Russia wakes up every morning and the first thought on his mind is, what can I do today to defeat the United States of America in the war that I am in? And I suspect our president wakes up every day, and at some point, the thought that crosses his mind is, what can I do today to make sure we don't get into a war with Russia? That's the pattern I've seen for the last 2.5 years. That's a dangerous mismatch. And so what I hope we get out of the next election, Constantine, what I hope we see, regardless of who the American people choose, is a growing clarity of the challenge that we face. And I understand that there's a lot of nervousness and trepidation among friends and partners in Europe and elsewhere in the world about what's at stake in the U.S. elections and the various choices. I would say, the American people are going to make this choice. There is a wisdom to the country. As Corey said earlier, it'll be white knuckles at times. But we will be there. We're there right now. Our United States Congress just passed a $61 billion assistance package for Ukraine, as large as all the assistance combined that we have provided to date to the Ukrainian people. We did it with a Republican speaker in the House of Representatives. We did it in the midst of a presidential election in which one candidate made this the centerpiece of his foreign policy, and in the end, the other remained silent. In the United States, we have a saying, silence equals consent. We succeeded in doing this, so don't get too caught up on our politics. Have confidence in us. Do the right thing in Europe, not because it's for us, not to protect yourselves against the exigencies of American politics. Do it because it's the right thing to do. Strengthen your defense. Align your policies with your democratic neighbors and your democratic allies, and show a sense of urgency.
That is a great way to wrap up this panel. Thank you so much to all of you for this great discussion. Thank
you. Sharon, please join us over here. I would like to follow up on some things that have been said during the panel.
So
It was mentioned several times that the countries you discussed, that it's not a formal alliance, that it's just a group of countries with the same interest, that it's not durable, and let's hope it's not durable. So if that is so, what do you think about playing those countries against each other? Is it doable?
Well, you have to find something to play against each other. I mean, I think one of the things, in some ways it was very pessimistic. I think one of the things the panelists agreed is that we have limited tools for trying to break up that alliance. But I think one of the things that was agreed upon is that a Ukrainian victory is perhaps one of the best ways of trying to break up that alliance.
Sure, and so that was like an external aspect. And what about the internal aspect? What about a common approach of the West towards those countries? Do you think it is attainable?
I think it's hard to speak about the West in general. I think one of the things that was brought up is that there are differences between Europe and within Europe and the U.S. So having a unified strategy, NATO may not be, as they mentioned, sort of the right platform. The EU might not be. So the West needs to come up with that strategy together.
Thank you, Sharon, for hosting this session and for your insight.
It's my pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.